In the last lecture, you learned about instance versus class attributes. We have the same concept around the methods that we define in a class. So we have instance method as well as class methods. In this example, both these methods that we have defined in the point class are instance methods. So we can call them using an instance of the point class, using an object. Generally speaking, you use these instance methods whenever we need an object reference. For example, when drawing a point, we really need to work with a specific point object. That is why this draw method is defined as an instance method. But there are times that we don't really need an existing object, and that's when we use a class method. For example, let's say in our program, there are a lot of cases where we want to create a point with these initial values, 0 and 0. This is one way to create a point object, and that's perfectly fine. But we can come up with a different way to create a point object with these values, like this. Point, so note that I'm using a class reference, then dot 0. In this case, 0 is a method that is defined at the class level, and when we call it, it will return a point object initialized with these values. So we can get this point object and assign it to this point variable. Now, in this example, we refer to this 0 method as a factory method because it's like a factory. It creates a new object. Now, this example is pretty basic. Creating a 0 point with these initial values is not a big deal. But there are times that initializing an object can be pretty complex. So every time you want to create an object of a given type, you might have to pass some magical values here, and you might have to repeat this in several places in your program. In that case, instead of passing all these magical values to create an object, you can define a factory method that will return an object with these values. And this way you can move this complexity of creating this object into that factory method. Okay, so let's delete what we have on line 10 and see how we can define a method at the class level. So back to our point class, we define a method, call it 0, and call its first parameter CLS, which is short for class. Again, this is purely a convention. We can call this anything, but by convention, whenever we define a class method, we call its first parameter CLS. And as you can guess, this is a reference to the class itself. So here we're not working with a point object or a point instance. Now, to make this method a class method, we need to decorate it with something like this. @class method. This is what we call a decorator, and it's a way to extend the behavior of a method or a function. We'll look at decorators and how they work internally later in this section. So, this is all you have to do to create a class method in Python. Now, in this class method, we have a reference to our class. So with that, we can create a point object with initial values. So we call CLS and give it these initial values. This is exactly like calling point of 0 and 0. The difference is that if we use CLS, at runtime, when we call the 0 method, Python interpreter will automatically pass a reference to the point class to this 0 method. Okay? So we create a point object and then return it. Save the changes. Now, when we run the program, we get a point with these initial values.